Okay. There it is, record. Okay, so I'm recording because we're going to share this on our YouTube page. Some of you may realize you know that already. We did this last time. We was wanted everybody to be able to benefit from this presentation. So tonight we have Dr. Laurie Stankavich is our presenter. And this is interesting. The title is interesting, like Dr. Mountain said. And Dr. Laurie's title is This is the Way the World Ends, the Rhetoric of Future Narratives. And yeah, looking forward to this presentation. So Laurie has taught 14 years at Southern Adventist University. She taught secondary school as well at Union Springs Academy and international schools in Taiwan. I worked overseas for many, many years, including Taiwan, Korea, Costa Rica, and China. I actually worked in Korea too, and I had a great time. So I hope you enjoyed it too. I'm sure you did, since you did so much overseas work. I'm sure it was great. Laurie's first professional hat is as a linguist. She graduated from University of Texas at Arlington with an MA in linguistics too many years ago. I won't say the number. She finished her PhD at Old Dominion just 2 years ago, 2022, which personally, I'm a fan of just continuing education, right? You just keep learning stuff forever, you know? So hopefully your PhD is not the end of your education. You just keep learning too. I'm sure you will. It's kind of who you are. Laurie's areas for a PhD were rhetoric, writing, and writing studies, with a second track in digital and new media. She says she doesn't have any notable publications yet, which I don't think is true, because right after that, she says that her dissertation won an award for best writing across the curriculum in 2022, which that sounds notable to me. Originally, she planned to talk about that research, the research of her dissertation, but then her interest has recently swerved in another direction, which is the focus of her presentation this evening, this new direction that her research has gone in. So, Laurie Stankavich, ladies and gentlemen, welcome so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And Laurie, the time is yours. And I'm gonna get out of your way. I'm gonna mute and I'm gonna turn my camera off, but I'm not going anywhere. So, I'll be monitoring the chat. I'll be sitting right here. So,
All right, sounds good. You are now seeing my screen, I assume. And this all starts when I'm doing so AI came along, the generative AI thing that we're all knee deep in or neck deep in now. And I ended up on a task force for that, and I became fascinated and started reading about it, and decided that I wanted to teach a class called Texts and Tech, the Philosophy and Rhetoric of AI. And so I set myself a goal to read 25 books this summer about tech in some way or another. And these are some of the questions on the slide here that I've been kind of workshopping in this reading. And one of the things that I kind of got into with all of this is the idea of narrative. So we have the story of AI. Is AI going to kill us all? Is it going to take all our jobs? Is it dystopian or is it utopian? Is it going to transform the world? But whatever the case, we are looking at a future there. And so everybody is well aware that we are in the tumultuous summer of a presidential election. And obviously there are many narratives battling there. And this kind of comes back to a thing that I do in my rhetoric class. Here's the textbook you can see here. And by the way, I want this to be a conversation. It's a presentation. I'm talking. I'm going to have a few times where I'm going to ask people to like weigh in and say stuff. But anytime you want to weigh in and say stuff, go ahead and do that. These are some ideas that I'm workshopping. They're not necessarily perfectly formed, and when I get to the end of this, I'll actually talk about the part that I think I may find most fascinating at least at this point in time, which ends up not being exactly what the main backbone of this presentation is, but I'm also interested in what I'm talking about here, which is apocalyptic rhetoric. All right, but narrative is something that has really fascinated me in my rhetoric class. And it's in this textbook, which is topical. It's under forms of symbolic action. So it is paralleled with a chapter in visual rhetoric, a chapter about how language works, where they talk about semiotics and stuff like that. And when I started teaching this class, it was around the time of the 2016 presidential election, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I'm going to use the definition from the textbook, which is not their definition, but it is from this other gentleman, Gerald Prince. So they're quoting him. And this is the definition of rhetoric that, narrative. Narrative that they are using is that it is the representation of at least two real or fictive events or situations in a time of sequence, neither of which presupposes or entails the other. Now, I am not a literature scholar. So those of you who are literature people, you recognize, of course, that narrative and narratology is a tradition within literature and as well as within rhetoric. And I don't know how this one would compare, but I assume it's probably pretty much the same idea that you have basically a time orientation, you have a sequential aspect, and based on that, you develop this essentially a story. So here's my class activities that I've done with it. My first, I think this may have been around the first time that I taught, or was it the second time I taught the rhetoric class? At any rate, very early on in my teaching of the rhetoric class, we had all been surprised, or at least some of us, I guess, had been surprised by Trump's election in 2016. So I noticed that a lot of people were processing their confusion at that point by saying, okay, this shocked us. How did we get here? Why did Trump win? We didn't expect this. And so you had a lot of different explanations for why that might have been. So I gave a different opinion piece with a different narrative to each student in the class, or maybe it was to each pair of students. I don't exactly remember how I did it. And then I asked them to extract the narrative and to share it with the class. And then I've done different things, different years. And then this last time I taught the class, I had just read a research article on national narratives of AI in the US versus the national narratives of AI in China. And after reading that article, I thought, okay, this is interesting. And there are definitely narratives here being implied by these policy statements. So let's see what students can do with another country. So I chose New Zealand because I found a policy document for New Zealand, and it had some different points of view. It had a banker. I think it had their current prime minister or president or whatever their national leader was at the time. So once again, I gave different statements to each student and had them extract the narrative. So students are actually have a little bit of trouble with this. So here's a tip that I give them. I tell them to start with once upon a time. So say, once upon a time, what was true? And then say, and then what happened? And then what happened? And then where did that bring us? So if we were looking at the tech narrative, then maybe it was once upon a time. The programmers ran programs that were constructed line by line by programmers. The programs did exactly what people told them to do. Then Silicon Valley companies developed machine learning tools that made it possible for, and eventually we get to, all of this is presupposed by, for example, New Zealand policy people. They know. So the students and the policy people are building with a baseline once upon a time that is not necessarily present in their policy statement, but nevertheless, the students can extract it and they can show how there is an underlying narrative there. All right, so I'm going to put on the screen one blog post and see. I would like to have people weigh in, read through this if you can see it, and tell me, somebody, what is the narrative here? What's the once upon a time? What was the world like in the beginning here? And then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? I got people? Oh, I guess you have to have time to think, don't you? Of course. Yeah, I thought about putting people into like breakout rooms and having them talk about this and process it, but I figured that we would be a small group and we could probably just kind of do that. So, and we are, so we can.
Well, we got one of those things where somebody tries to give a generalization about the times we're living in and what kind of response we need to make based on their perception. And it's kind of a homogenous times we live in the sense that there's like one truth that's put out there about this is the way things are now. So this is what we need to do. It's what I would call a simplifying narrative.
Yeah, I think that's right. But let me take you back just a little before that, because this is often the case when you have in rhetoric, when you have people giving a narrative that makes an argument, very often they start with an assumption that they don't actually include. So what are they assuming? What was this? It's a narrative of nostalgia to a certain extent. What are they nostalgic about here?
Well, there used to be a time when the church was very distinct from the world, and we are witnessing ongoing erosion of the borders between the church and the world, and we need to get back to when the church and the world had very distinct borders from each other.
Okay, good. Let's have one other person here weigh in on this narrative, and then we'll go on.
I think in addition to what Scott was saying, which I agree with, I think I see the idea that the church has perhaps lost some of its moral standard, maybe. Um, I mean, especially the last paragraph, the idea of the implication that there is no more a moral majority and the focus on the family sort of push of the church is gone, which to me indicates the idea that the church doesn't no longer has that, and it could sort of maybe as a component of what Scott was saying, this merging of the church and the world. Maybe the church no longer has that moral high ground, perhaps.
Right. And there's a very typical narrative that we're seeing here, and we will talk about it a little bit later on. But here it is interesting that in this particular blog, usually in this narrative, in the Christian America and the secular onslaught narrative, you have the evildoers are the secularists, but here we also are, he's also pointing to the church itself as bearing some blame here. And that's actually kind of interesting, but I won't really go into that.
This is Kayla. I just want to make an observation just for me. When
Mhm.
I read the very first sentence, the flock needs you, it's to me, it's making an assumption that I don't read and try to understand for myself. I'm not waiting on my spiritual leaders to tell me what to think about what's happening naturally around me. I listen to what they say. I take into account that they have studied and that they're seeking God. But to me, to make the assumption that without their leadership, I'm a lost sheep just wandering, I don't think we can make that assumption about this is too broad for me to say the church as a whole, it's individualized. So I don't know. That's just a big assumption to address us all because we're from the church represents different denominations. The church represents a different array of thinking. It's too much to just put us all in one basket to
Mhm.
say we're all responding to what we see around us the same way because that's not true.
So I'm glad you're mentioning that because I think that what I'm going to claim without other without other examples is that we have a kind of a general narrative that's out in the public discourse. And as I alluded to, the narrative of a Christian America, a narrative of loss, a narrative of attack from secular forces and all of that. And so this is just one instance of it. And when you have it, when my students are looking at it, then I think that's a really fair point to make. As we look at narratives and look at a news story, an opinion piece or something like that, and say, look, what is the underlying narrative that is being alluded to here? You can take some part of it and say, well, here's this thing that I don't agree with. So this is a particular political stance, which no doubt you recognize as belonging to a particular political party. But there could be an element of truth, I suppose, and yet we might, as Christians, maybe not this type of Christian necessarily, but we might push back and say, well, you know, there's elements of your story that I can buy, but there are also elements that I reject. I reject this idea that the church is a very hierarchical place, and some people are the leaders, and the rest of us, you know, are just the followers. By the way, Scott Voigt comes from the charismatic New Apostolic Reformation tradition, and so they actually do believe that in their theology, that there are apostles and that other people, and that your rank and file followers are just followers, I guess. Anyway, not to get into their theology, let's go on to the idea of future narratives. So it seems to me, as I was thinking about it, the narrative, because narrative orders events in time by definition, it has to move the imagination away from the present. It could be past, you know, a lot of stories are written in the past and all of the events are in the past and they do not bring us to the present, although we might, in some sense, understand them as illuminating the present. They don't speak directly to the present. Other stories bring us from the past to the present. How did we get here? And then other stories are looking into the future and saying, what do we imagine given our present state? What do we imagine if trends continue and if certain events happen, the future might look like? So one of the books I read this summer was this book, The Future by Jennifer Gidley. And one of the points that she made is she prefers to talk about futures rather than the future, although she accepted the preference of her editors to use the future rather than futures in the title of the very short introduction. But not only are there different futures that we might see, and there are different views or visions of the future that we hear about in our public discourse. For example, in Sean Voigt's, he sees a possible future where the church gets their act together and pushes back against the forces that are attacking them, and good things happen for America. And he also sees the possibility of a future where that doesn't happen. So that is a view of the future, but there's also models of futurism, and that is how scholars or futurists think about the future. So Gidley gives us 5 in her book, and I'm only giving the first 3 here. So you've got the predictive analytical, and this is your old-fashioned, let's call it objectivist type of philosophy of the future, where you look at trends and you say, okay, based on these trends moving forward, the probable future is whatever it is. You're forecasting, essentially. Then you've got the critical and the postmodern, and they look at texts and media artifacts. So they're looking at things like Sean Voigt's blog post, and they're saying, well, this is the future that's being proposed. Maybe we don't agree with it, or maybe we do agree with it, but we're going to critique it, and we're going to cast our vision of the preferred future. And then, and this is not necessarily an activist model, but then presumably we could act to incarnate that preferred future. And then we have the cultural interpretive, where we're using our imagination, we're using ethnographic research, qualitative dialogue, we're talking to people, and we're looking at possible futures. So in a sense, the rest of this presentation is about possible futures because we're looking at particular narratives here. It's important to point out that utopia versus dystopia is widely talked about. And here's another book I started reading this summer. So utopian views humanity and its future with either hope or alarm. If it's viewed with hope, the result is usually a utopia. If it's viewed with alarm, the result is usually a dystopia. However, some people's utopia are other people's dystopias. So let's take a look at the Singapore smart city. This is a thing that's apparently happening, is that Singapore is using technology in its public spaces in a really large scale way. So to zoom in on,
If you want us to see what you clicked on, you gotta
I
stop
gotta
sharing the PowerPoint and then
yeah, hold on, I
reshare.
gotta reshare.
Yeah.
I had forgotten that.
Yeah.
I'm taught with Zoom and it's, yeah. Okay, so here you've got the Dunga Fever app, which tells you where the Dunga clusters are. I guess I can see that is valuable. I don't suppose it's to my mind, moved into a dystopia yet. A parking app where you can pay for parking easily. All right, all right. We have the encouraging water conservation, so smart meters. All right, sure, maybe. But what about this? The drones and robots flying around looking at things? I'm a little less sure if I would really like that. What about the Healthy 365 app that promotes wellness by simplifying health tracking? So you've got every citizen of Singapore is going to have these health trackers tracking them at all times. For me, that's moving a little bit more dystopian. I don't know how you feel about that, but the point is, one person's utopia can be somebody else's dystopia. Are you seeing my dystopia, utopia slide now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So moving forward with this. All right. So I want to theorize now apocalyptic narratives. So first of all, apocalyptic narratives are meaning making. They serve as a template to construct different sets of cultural anxieties at different moments in time. Of course, we're talking about current ones, so at this moment of time. Often use quasi-religious language. Apocalyptic rhetoric borrows the kairotic flexibility and religious prestige of apocalyptic narratives to imbue otherwise irreligious situations with the same supernatural significance. The one we saw, the Sean Foyt one, of course, he is talking about religion, but we'll look at some that have apocalyptic framings that are not religious at all. Okay, another one, scholar O'Leary, he notes the affinity between the apocalyptic mentality and that of the conspiracy theorist, in that both offer a similar view of history as a gigantic clash of occult forces. So what's the distinction? Conspiracy theories are more spatial in orientation. So you can imagine the people with their stereotypical bulletin board with all the thumbtacks and all the strings between them. In other words, all the places and currents within the, cabal or whatever that's coming together to harm us. So that would be a conspiracy theory. Apocalyptic narratives are temporal. In other words, we are looking at events spread over time. And O'Leary also talks about the three particular topoi that you find in apocalyptic rhetoric. They describe an evil that threatens the group's existence or maybe the entire planet's existence, imagines a time when the future becomes present. In other words, something cataclysmic happens, and draws on authority for fixing trust in troubled times. The authority in the narrative, it can be a leader, like an occult leader type of situation, or it can be a spokesperson, or it can be whoever's aligning with the narrative in the same way that conspiracy theories are, where you have this knowledge because you have this story that has explanatory power, and then it gives you a little bit of authority in terms of claiming what the future is going to be like. Okay, so another idea that I found really interesting to go into the weeds on a little bit is the apocalyptic sublime. Okay, question everyone, have any of you heard of the apocalyptic sublime before?
I have not.
Okay. I hadn't either. When I started looking into it, I realized that it is out there. This was in the Rhetorical Society Quarterly that I found an article about it. Well, actually, I found an article called "No Lives Matter," and that was an interesting article about our current political moment. But they referenced this 2000 article by Gunn and Beard that talked about the apocalyptic sublime. And so when I started reading that article, I was like, wow, this is a weird sounding concept, but it is really useful. So let me unpack it. Apocalyptic sublime, I'll call it a subclass of apocalyptic narratives, but I do want to complicate that in a little bit. So basically, you have two types of apocalyptic narrative. You have the imminent and the imminent, and I know these are pronounced the same. So the first one, the imminent, is your traditional apocalyptic narrative. So, your Adventist great controversy, Jesus is coming again. So Jesus is coming soon. Jesus is coming is imminent. However, it is over a historical timeline. So every day we're approaching nearer. Eventually it will arrive. But today is not, we are living in the final days, but today is not the final day. The imminent narrative operates as if the end were already present. So we are living in this crisis of apocalypse in this very moment. So here in the imminent with an A narrative, the linear temporality is collapsed, and the participants are sort of, I think of it as kind of caught in amber, or in this moment of time, frozen time, where we are in this state of transition, confusion, ambivalence, of apocalyptic crisis or chaos. And I would like to just pause here for a moment. I'm going to have a screen here in a minute where I put some of our current narratives that are available in public, or that we meet in public discourse, on the screen. But can anybody think of one that you would say, there's a narrative that you hear a lot, like on Twitter or wherever, and political speeches or something, that operates this way, that it is not, there's no end point per se, but it's sort of already arrived and always still arriving, like all the time? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, climate change is one where people are saying, climate change is already here. It's already potentially catastrophic, but it's also still coming. The 2024 election, Democrats have depicted a future apocalypse if Trump is reelected. Trump is talking about what he'll do, that that if the Democrats were to win, although he's not allowing that possibility, how terrible things are right now. We're already in an apocalyptic state, but I can rescue you from it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Those are excellent examples. And so when I read this article, that was the sort of thing those were the sorts of things that popped into my head. And I thought, wow, this is really a useful explanatory concept. And so I wanted to play with it. So that's basically why I'm doing this presentation. There's one other point I want to get to here, though, and that's the sublime part. Because when I first saw this two-word phrase, apocalyptic sublime, the sublime part didn't really, it's not a word we use that much. But after they explained it, I was like, okay, yes, that makes a lot of sense. So they're taking Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant, two people that I haven't read, but I certainly have heard of them. So here's Burke. So whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain, danger, that is to say, whatever is any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of sublime. There's also the view of the sublime, of course, with grandeur and magnificence. But I thought it was interesting that terror also brings us to the sublime in this model. So his insight is that it's a psychological understanding of the sublime. There are rhetoric, in the rhetorical tradition, you have people like Longinus way back in the early Middle Ages, who talked about the sublime as if it were beautiful language and stuff like that. But here Burke is thinking of the sublime as a psychological state. And then Kant also draws on this and talks about a psychological foundation. Well, I'm not sure he's drawing on Burke, but I mean, he's also speaking of the sublime in this way. But he's adding two things that the authors, Gunn and Beard, find very interesting. And that is, one is that the subject is destabilized in the face of the sublime. So that's why I chose the image that I chose here of this person kind of staring into something grand and terrifying. And at the same time, even though something might be terrible, it gives you sort of a pleasure, I suppose, maybe like a horror film or something like that. You're staring at it transfixed. So an apocalyptic narrative that mesmerizes and terrifies participants falls under the apocalyptic sublime, and I'm arguing that it has great political power, which is not something that Gunn and Beard go into a great deal, but that was what jumped out at me. Okay, so here's the ones that I came up with off the top of my head. Then I went and I looked and I said, hey, are people talking about this? Are they looking at these as narratives? And are they using the word apocalyptic to refer to them? And the answer is yes. So the secular threat or the Christian nation facing attack, your Sean Foyt narrative, you have at least these two scholars, and in fact, many more have talked about that. Climate catastrophe being talked about as apocalyptic rhetoric. Yes, absolutely. The one that popped into my head was this: they want to take our guns, this idea of some amorphous they out there who is, just yearning to rob you of the freedom of self-defense. And yes, that one has also been theorized as apocalyptic narrative. White replacement, and then the super intelligent machines, which brings us to my AI reading. I'll talk about that one at the end, though. I want to talk about these just a little bit more. So, discussion questions. So, read the questions, have comments for just a bit here. Won't spend a lot of time, but would love to get some comments. Any question? We're not going to go through them or anything. Go ahead.
Well, raising the specter of any of these threats is a way of legitimizing whatever actions you want to take in response to this threat. So making the threat a very clear and present danger, presenting it that way, is a way of legitimating what might be otherwise seen as questionable actions by yourself in response to that perceived threat. In other words, you're not perceived as the aggressor, you're perceived as defending something that you already have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So taking it in apocalyptic terms gives you a lot more scale for action, perhaps. Another comment on this slide.
I think one of the things that these four sort of points might have in common is a look toward the past as being sort of better in some ways than the present, or perhaps the future. I guess that's what apocalyptic means, but they want to take our Bibles. In other words, we have this thing and they're trying to take it from us, right? Climate change is going to kill us. We used to have a cool earth and now it's getting hot. They want to take our guns. We used to have these rights and now they're trying to take them away. They're trying to replace us. We used to hold these positions and they're trying to take them away from us, right? So I guess part of the underlying narrative in each case is some version of it used to be better, and we should return to how it used to be in some ways in order to sort of mediate some of the problems we're having.
That's excellent. It also makes me think about the human aversion to loss. You know, humans hate to lose things more than they love to gain things. I don't know who it was that found that out, whether it was the Freakonomics people or somebody. You know, it's one of our biases, right? So maybe the fear of loss is intolerable. All right, the next screen, next slide here is the same narratives, but another term that we use in the rhetoric textbook that I found useful is the tragic versus the comic frame. So a tragic frame basically looks at a story and says that the unfortunate events are caused by malicious or evil forces. So if you were to take the top one here, they want to take our Bibles, then you have a very clear they, and they're bad people. A comic would be unfortunate events are caused by unwitting or foolish acts, an accident rather than an act of malice. Maybe you could use that with climate change one, possibly some do at any rate, that we were unaware of what we were doing. We were not malicious as human beings, but we were misguided and we were lost in making unwise decisions or something like that. I think I'll go on rather than ask more questions about this one, but I do think that the tragic versus the comic frame is also useful for students to just when we're using some of these narratives in public discourse to have them think about that and how that shapes the narrative. Okay, this is a part that I'm really very interested in. It becomes a little bit tricky here, because only the first one is an apocalyptic narrative. So I've been talking about apocalyptic narratives for much of this presentation. The artificial general intelligence or superintelligence is going to kill us all is certainly an apocalyptic narrative. It isn't really widely held, although it's held by some very influential people. And one of the really weird aspects of the current time we're in vis-a-vis technology development is that some of the people claim to believe that AGI is going to kill us all, and yet they also believe that they should develop it and they should be the ones to develop it. So this part, you know, the OpenAI thing that happened a while back, where you have this, I don't know how, you know, how focused in on tech news you are, but you have this guy called Sam Altman who was pushed out of OpenAI, and then he, through his clever machinations, was able to return to his position, and I think it was CEO, to stay in. And part of the issue there appeared to be the case that some of the other people on the team were afraid that they were moving too fast, and that superintelligence was going to kill everyone, and that they should slow down and think about putting some solutions in place to the extent that you can as you're extrapolating into the distant future. But that's called the AI safety movement. And so a lot of the people that were against him were AI safety people. Incidentally, AI safety is not referring to other types of harms, which I'll get to in a moment here. But again, the same people that were claiming that it was going to potentially or even probably kill us all were also clamoring to get the investment to go on building it. Then you have views that are potentially utopian, depending on who you are. Have any of you heard of TESCREAL, this weird acronym? Anyone?
I wish I had. I wish I could say yes.
Okay, well, I'm not going to unwrap it all because it is a little bit complex, but I'll take three of them. T stands for transhumanism, so I'll come to that in just a sec. C stands for cosmism. Have you heard of Elon Musk wants us all to live in Mars? or maybe not all of us to live in Mars, maybe just some people, selected people to live in Mars. So cosmism is the idea of a planetary escape. The world gets so bad, and so at least some select people go off and live in Mars. Long-termism is, that's the L at the end. Long-termism is a very weird view where they believe that the lives of human beings in our present moment are not worth much. So solving global poverty, for instance, not an issue at all. We're not concerned about that. We're not even concerned about climate change all that much because some humans will undoubtedly survive. So the long-termists are concerned about at least say having human beings existing for the next 1,000 years or so. And they assume that we will also be uploading our consciousness into a cloud or into planetary servers on other planets or something. I know this sounds really weird, but people believe this. And so because you would have millions of people and billions of people living spread across space at that time, the hope of them existing absolutely trumps any pain or suffering in our current world. So because what you're looking at is you're looking for an aggregate of joy. So the digital beings would have, a certain amount of joy, but there would be so many millions and billions of them that that joy would certainly trump our little bit of joy now. And then the transhumanism is this idea that we will be conjoined with the machine. So we will have neural links and we will have more and more bionic parts, probably do some DNA tweaking, and we will become these, superhuman beings. So utopia, not for me, but it is one of the most interesting things that I've discovered in my reading about technology is that these views are actually fairly prominent among tech billionaires, and that I find to be personally somewhat scary. But the more probable dystopia is the death from 1,000 paper cuts kind of idea, not literally paper cuts, this is metaphorical, but talking about things like biased AI, facial recognition that is working more poorly on some races than others, or systems that are deciding who's guilty of welfare fraud, and you talk to a machine and not a person and you can't defend yourself, or killing people with drones, all of the ways that little by little our lives become worse because more and more is being outsourced to the machines. So this is a whole other topic, but I'm just throwing it in here at the end. Final observations. I think it's possible. I want to point out that it's possible to draw together some of these apocalyptic narratives. So white supremacists, for example, are often Christian nationalists as well, and so on. I also think that it's probably fair to say that something like, well, just off the top of my head, they're going to take our gods. Let's use that one. Has some political potency. It's probably not the case that everybody would take it to the apocalyptic sublime stage and be like, they're horrible and they're coming. But there's some people that are probably sort of on a continuum where they're thinking that there's a threat because we have people that are on the political left, and maybe they're gaining some power in my state or in my community or something, and they may have gun control policies I don't like, but they're not paralyzed by it. They're saying, okay, so I'll vote for different people, or I'll go to a town hall or something. I'll do something. So I'm not sure that just because some people are transfixed by the apocalyptic quality that everybody is. So I was thinking maybe it's something like an experiential setting, so something like a temperature. So there's a high fever state where you're just you're paralyzed by it. You can't take any actions but rage on Twitter all day. And no, I don't call it X. Or you would be a little bit aligned with maybe some of the people that believe some of those things, but on a very low temperature kind of way. You don't believe half the things you'd say, and you don't think it's that dire. And for me, as I was thinking about that, I wondered whether at times as Adventists, we've taken our own apocalyptic narrative, like those of us who've grown up Adventists, remember that our time of trouble stories, maybe as children, like I used to hold my hand in hot dishwater to prepare myself for persecution in the time of trouble when I was, 11 or something. And but we don't find it helpful, I think, to be paralyzed by the horror of what may come. And so I think it's a caution for us as well to recognize that, yes, we have an apocalyptic narrative, but it doesn't have to capture us in an apocalyptic sublime. So that's all I've got. So questions,
Questions for Laurie?
comments, complaints.
I might have one or two. I'll let other people jump in. Thank you, Laurie, so much. I love the idea as just a comment. I love the idea of, and this is for everybody, whether you're live or you're watching on YouTube later. I love the idea that you're making a presentation that you haven't fully thought all the way through yet, and you're like workshopping some ideas. That's fantastic, I think, for this kind of environment, where we're all just kind of trying to learn together. So I really love that approach that you took. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. It helped me a lot because I told myself from the beginning, this is the way it's going to be. And at times I thought, so if it's really bad, then I will give courage to many people, hopefully. So,
Well, see, I don't think your approach could be bad because you started with let's think it through together, and here's some things I found and let's talk. So I think that's great, So thank you for that approach. Very, very refreshing for me.
I think that's awesomely ambitious that you set out a goal of reading 25 books on the future,
Yeah.
AI and whatnot. I know the summer's not over yet, but how's that going?
well, I've got my 25 now. These are not scholarly books. They're written by some smart people. Some are shorter, some are longer, some are written by scholars, but mostly popular audience, which helps a lot. So yeah, I think I'm at 27.
Nice.
So, yeah. That wasn't just the summer. I started around Christmas or so. If you're interested, a podcast that I'm really enjoying is one called Tech Won't Save Us. So if you're a podcast listener.
I am. Could you put that in the chat?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, Laurie, I'm assuming that your title, the first half of your title at least, comes from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. Or was it just coincidental? I'm assuming.
Coincidental.
Okay. I was going to ask you, how did that influence your project? But
I'm
you
not
said
well read in the right way.
Okay. Okay. I just knew that's where it came from, because I think it ends with, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whisper.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that, right?
I probably had that like vaguely floating in my head without thinking that it was, Eliot. And I also did have the Fire and Ice, the Robert Frost poem,
Yes.
vaguely in my head as well.
Yes, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I think it's a whimper, not with a bang, but with
Whimper. Yes, whimper. That's what it is. Thank you.
So Google's telling me anyway.
Yeah, it's probably whimper. That makes more sense than a whisper. Yes. Okay.
I'm happy to answer questions about like AI and tech or offer them for free, even if you don't ask.
So I have a question about, and I know this is, again, you're workshopping an idea, but you started with talking about really kind of teaching narrative to your students and helping them see the narrative components in something that's not necessarily presented as a story, right? You can just
Right, absolutely.
yeah.
These are usually op-eds.
Yeah, right. So have you done that with these kinds of pieces, with sort of future-looking apocalyptic pieces yet, or is that a new sort of addition?
Not apocalyptic. No, that is new because I read the Apocalyptic Sublime article and I'm like, oh, I see that in all of this overheated narrative of our political cycle and divisions. You will recognize that more of them were on the political right than on the political left. It's probably somewhat revealing of my own. We don't see we see the others' narratives better than our own. I've chosen to be, I will say this, I've chosen to be a political independent because I don't want anyone to own my soul or my mind or my critical faculties. And it's sort of like nowadays a yin yang kind of thing. You know, if one side says this, then the other side has to say exactly what's opposite. So they speak to each other, and sometimes other discourses are possible. You know, and so, but it was interesting to me as a person who, for example, basically accepts the climate crisis as a genuine crisis, to say, but wait a minute, maybe we're apocalypticizing this in a way that's actually unhelpful for political action. Could be, because if people are paralyzed, they're going to be like, it's inevitable.
Doesn't
There's
matter.
nothing
Yeah.
I can do. I
Yeah.
might as well just give up. And if you're Adventist, like, oh, Jesus is coming anyway. Oh, well.
Mm. That reminds me of a scene from a TV show. It might be too specific. I'll save it. Go ahead. I saw Scott opening his mouth.
No, I was just saying, I think it's helpful, like you were saying, to think about the narrative behind the narrative that's presented in the surface. What's the discourse that's supporting the words that are appearing? So you can think of the words that are appearing like the tip of the iceberg, and then there's a whole iceberg underneath that discourse that is legitimizing it, at least to the people that it's intended for.
Right, and this is probably obvious, but I want to say it explicitly, and that is we are actually interested in, or I am interested in the collective narratives, because certainly there's also surface narratives. So you have this author in this op-ed who's telling this story. Okay, that's fine. But what I really want my students to see are what are the bigger narratives that are underlying the public discourse and this particular collective, this type of people. So like, for example, the tech, you know, the superintelligence is going to kill us is a good example. It's not on the political right or on the political left, but there's a particular type of people that actually tend to believe or to promote that narrative. And it's interesting to look at it and say, okay, so why these people? What brings them together to share this collective narrative?
Yeah, interesting stuff. We got about 2 minutes till we're out of time, so love to get 1 or 2 more comments if there are.
Well, I was just thinking about the way narrative, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the way narratives are being used now in our political discourse. I've been hearing in the last 2 or 3 days different pundits talking about how, well, Kamala Harris has to define herself before Donald Trump defines her. Now we're having each of the potential vice presidential candidates that she might choose from defined by different pundits, saying, here are 4 or 5 salient characteristics about each of these 6 or 7 potential candidates. We're always dealing with simplified narratives to try and conceptualize a complex world that we live in. And the apocalyptic is one of those ways. People are complex. We have a guy down the street who's had a Trump 2024 flag out since the election of 2020. And I'm tempted to see him in a certain way just based on that particular point. But he's also out in front playing catch with his daughters, mowing his lawn, doing other things that I admire, you know. So I keep trying to remind myself not to slap a totalizing narrative over this phenomenon or that person.
Yeah, actually, I got this Routledge companion to narrative, and I read a couple of pieces in that. It didn't make it into my talk at all. But somebody in Finland, a scholar in Finland, is doing a project called The Danger of Narrative. And one of the things that I believe that she's doing there is talking about this tendency for news people, opinion people, pundits and whatnot to do exactly what you were talking about, Scott, and that is say, okay, so-and-so's got to define, or we've got to define them, or somebody's going to define you. And then also businesses, brands are told, oh, you have to have your story, you have to tell your narrative, you have to define it. And I think she's kind of, I haven't read her work beyond just the introduction piece in the companion, but it sounds like she's pushing back against that a little bit. And I think that could be a good thing.
All right. I suspect, because this topic is really very interesting, I suspect we could probably do this all night. So I'm going to stop us at 6:01. So let's let's get out of here. Thank you so much, Laurie. Dr.
Perfect.
Stankavich, really, really interesting. Definitely appreciate the courage it took to present something that wasn't done yet. I love that. And I want to say to both our live audience and our YouTube audience, we don't have our presenter lined up yet for August. We want to make a presentation each month leading up to next summer. And this is the last one we have actually a person in the slot for. So if you have something that you're thinking through, if you have something that you're really good at, something you want to share with us, or something you want to think through with the group, let me know. Shoot me an email, pdnixon@oakwood.edu, and I will be happy to discuss that with you and get you on the schedule. We want to make a presentation around this time next month, the fourth week of August, August 20. I don't remember what the Thursday is, 23rd or 24th or something like that. It doesn't have to be that day, but that's, that's our starting point, and we can adjust from there if we need to. So, and I hope you're looking in the chat, Laurie. You got a lot of thank yous in there. Um, so really, really good stuff. Thank you so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next summer. Watch out for an email from me for our next presentation coming up. And could we just close with prayer really quickly and then let you guys go about your business? All right. Thank you, Heavenly Father, once again for this opportunity you've given us. Thank you for Dr. Laurie Stankavich and her revolutionizing work and her just really thoughtful presentation. And thank you for the opportunity. Help us to continue to just be great in your presence, and help us to redirect all honor we get back to you, because we know we're here to serve, and that's what we want to do. Help us have a great night. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thanks again. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank
And we'll
you.
see you
Thank you,
guys next
everyone.
time.